Happy Friday! Full of jokes here this morning. Kara's laughing already. That's a good start to the pod. Welcome back.
Or a really bad start to something else.
Baloney was a great joke and a great start to the pod. So we're gonna do something a little different today. Our FU Fridays didn't seem to land that well last season, so we're mainly because it was always FU to Gensler, which I still feel, but it's not even just on Fridays. I feel that every day. But today we're going to talk about, over the last couple of years, we spent a lot of time talking about emergence of and uncertainty around regulation. And today we're going to talk just kind of somewhat high level about the general trends, some of the major things that have happened over the last couple of years and kind of where we were and where we're at. So we're going to kind of go through a little bit of the progress of global regulation. Does that sound about accurate, Kiara?
That's about accurate. I have to say that I was inspired because of some of the latest news about USDC pulling from Tron. And so a lot of the terms that we're seeing go around are about there being this gray market in crypto, things that are like not quite compliant, that might be compliant, but we don't know yet, things that aren't regulated, but are going to be regulated, that kind of thing. And so that's what we're going to run through. It is pretty America-centric, but we'll talk about MICA and a couple of other countries as well.
Perfect. Well, we don't want to keep people waiting. So let's do it.
I'll do it.
Okay, we're back.
So do you remember when crypto was considered like a black market product? Like, do you remember in 2010 when people were like meeting up in basements and swapping drives and stuff?
Yeah, or like a couple of months ago when everybody was like continuously saying that it's all for nefarious activities. Let's not approve an ETF because it's all it's all underworld type stuff. Yeah, I remember.
So there's like that, and then there's compliant crypto, which obviously is your centralized exchanges that are regulated and doing really well. But there's this new area called the gray market, which is surprisingly large entities that just are maybe not as compliant as an even larger entity might like. So they're probably moving within compliance or they're moving towards compliance, but they haven't quite hit it there yet. Before we kind of get into the news and the history, I thought maybe we should talk about what this gray area means. So
a
pretty obvious one is ICOs, right? Those are like initial coin offerings. People don't know if they're really legal or not.
Well, I can tell you that's not very gray. An ICO is not legal if you sell it to people in jurisdictions where your token may be a security. Yeah, that's the answer. Not really gray. Don't do an ICO if you're going to sell to people that you shouldn't sell to.
Okay, how about DeFi?
There is a lot of this kind of
gray.
It's not 100% gray, but there is some grayness there. So this is actually interesting. I was talking about this the other day because as we're all in the space trying to figure out how to navigate this, are we looking at what some other protocols are doing as examples of best and worst practices? Maybe, I don't know. Right. As I look around, though, there seems to be very little consensus over what is the correct path that's going to keep us most likely inside of compliance. And we really don't know what that looks like. So there's a lot of things that are being done that we're like, maybe that's good. Example, doing an ICO and not selling to Americans.
Right.
In theory, that prevents Americans from holding your token. But is there any other ways that Americans can get your token? And do you have any hand in facilitating that? Because if so, you've offered an unregistered security to U.S. persons. So there's a lot of these weird things that we're pretty sure that it should be fine as long as your other practices are also good. This Tron USDC thing, I mean, that's another we were talking about. I think it was yesterday. We were talking about, was that yesterday?
It was stables yesterday, yeah. We're going to do Tron USDC deep dive at the end, so be prepared.
Yeah, we'll get to it. But I mean, even stable coins, that's another one that we're like, well, is it a security? Maybe. Maybe not. I'm not entirely sure. And so no one really knows. There's a lot of this kind of weird gray area.
I think there's also an element of just how high the barriers to entry are, right? Like if you are trying to start a protocol, do you actually have the funds and the acumen to wade through all of the legality and make sure that you're 100% compliant? And what does that look like? Which was the whole point of DeFi, was that we could separate ourselves from that. But now that it is becoming regulated, how are we supposed to play in this new world, right?
So that's where I've been a critic of, like, just taking the old rules and applying them to the new technologies, because blockchain, in fact, can be audited real time. So, like, in real time, you could tell if we're compliant or not, which is generally pretty exciting and should be significantly cost reduced for both regulators and for entrepreneurs and creative types. But anyways, I think, like, it's such a challenge, and it's becoming such a burden again that we're literally going backwards now. To think about, as an example, Mica. I mean, how many licenses have been approved for Mica? Like, not very many. And of the ones, and of the ones that have been approved, most of them went through 6-month plus processes just to get the approvals. Many were declined. So, okay, Mica comes in June, but if only 5 companies, I'm exaggerating, if only 5 companies are licensed to function in the entire EU, then what? Is everybody that has a US person, or a EU person holding their token now in non-compliance? And how do you come into compliance? You won't give me a license, yet you're going to tell me that I'm not compliant. So what do I have to do to come into compliance or to get a license? And the answer currently in most jurisdictions is no one freaking knows. Really. Like, it's not that no one knows, it's just there's so much gray in the application process that gray, get it? But there's so much gray in the application process that I don't know. It's a bit of a crapshoot. It's tough. It's really tough to guesstimate how this is all going to come together in the end. But.
So, at least in terms of America, we know that cryptocurrencies have been facing compliance and regulation since about 2017. I mean, probably since they started, it was on the radar, but since 2017. And in 2018, the CFTC defined cryptocurrencies as commodities. But we didn't really start to get this narrative about compliance and regulation until 2021. And that is when the SEC stepped in and said things like, we will continue to take our authorities as far as they go. And when they started having actual enforcement actions, and when they started trying to declare crypto as securities instead of commodities, and when they started looking at how it might impact the nation as opposed to state by state. So 2021 is kind of when this narrative began, but it's obviously grown a lot since then. In 2021,
I remember talking about it
as a business owner. Yeah, were you like thinking about this?
But I was, yeah. I mean, but I've been thinking about this since the moment I entered the space, personally, because I came from TradFi. So, right. I mean, to me, there was never a doubt in my mind that we were going to have regulation. Like, if you are in a Western jurisdiction or a developed nation or even quasi-developed nation, there's going to be regulation, period. That's the type of government that we've all evolved into, whether we like it or not. So I always thought there's going to be regulation. How are we going to abide by this? We were kind of talking about regulation with the ETF applications and all that nonsense back in 2016, 17, 18. But again, that was kind of like, well, we're applying to the SEC because they're the ones who normally oversee ETFs, but right. Do they actually have jurisdiction? I mean, kind of from a high level, I think there should really be a new system entirely. I mean, imagine the money that the SEC has made off of these enforcement actions. Like, it's kind of mental. It almost feels
billions last year.
Yeah. And it kind of feels like they had a budget of $5 billion for this year or some nonsense. Right. And I mean, that's kind of incredible. A lot of it probably deserved for the idiots that are actually being convicted, but not all of them. I think some of them probably thought they
were. A lot of that backtracking, right? It was like, 4 years ago, you were on TV promoting this token that has now gone to court. And it's like, okay, well, nobody knew. It's not like they were necessarily malicious, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can make arguments on both sides of that coin, but I just hate to see the round peg square hole thing. because that's what we're doing right now. We're saying, hey, here's a new technology that offers us a ton of opportunity to remove barriers to entry, to increase accessibility to the masses, to make banking.
That's not what regulation wants. They want the opposite of that. That's why it exists.
Maybe not. I mean, their ultimate goal is to protect consumers. So are they doing their job by making it so that consumers
you don't want to like conspiracy theory this? No way is their ultimate goal to protect consumers. Okay. And then in 2022, people like JD and I were already arguing about what crypto regulation was going to look like in 2023. So Deloitte went in depth and they tried to pull out the key themes, and the big themes in 2022 that they thought they would see a lot of changes in 2023 were stablecoins, exchanges, and token classification. Guess what? All of that came true. We don't have to go too far into this, but in 2022, we were already talking about what do stablecoins look like? Who can actually issue these? Do they need to be banks? How does insurance work? How are geopolitics going to be involved? Are people going to be skeptical about this after the Terra Luna collapse? Is this actually going to improve financial stability? And same with exchanges. We said, okay, we've been seeing a lot of DeFi exchanges. How are we going to regulate them? Do we want to have things like ETFs? Is it going to be the CFTC or the SEC? And that was all in 2022. It feels like it was yesterday, but all of that was happening in 2022 already.
Yeah. I mean, I struggle with this a little bit again, because we're trying to track the progress of regulation, but there really, in my opinion, hasn't been any clarity. It's been a lot of flip-flopping, a lot of, here's an executive order, here's the SEC implying bullshit, here's...
Okay. Let's get into what's actually been passed then.
Okay, fine. Let's talk about that. Sure.
You're not talking about Deloitte at all. So let's
talk about I was getting there, but it's okay. Go ahead.
The first thing was in July 2023, we saw the U.S. Congress pass a bipartisan bill aimed at establishing a regulatory framework for crypto. This is in the States, obviously.
Right.
This is about federal oversight. This is about everybody being on board. This is about enhancing the CFTC oversight while also giving the SEC some new jurisdiction.
Yeah. It's worth noting that this passed from a congressional committee and still needs the Senate and the White House before it actually becomes law, which currently are not accepting these bills. So there's a lot of politicking happening right now between the White House, the Democrat-controlled Senate, and the Republican-controlled House in the US. So I think this is interesting in terms of this is what the Republicans in the House think regulation should look like. But Democrats don't agree. So, I mean, using this as a guideline to me is an act of futility. But there's just so much flip-floppy back and forthing and speculation about who's actually influencing decisions. Does Elizabeth Warren have outsized influence? Where is Gensler in this whole thing? Like, what does Bernie happen to think about this, because he's been so against crypto for so long? Like, it's just, I mean, there's so many people influencing this behind the scenes that it's impossible to predict what's going to happen. So I struggle with this a little bit, because trying to use these past legislations as some sort of insight to what's going to happen in the future, I think is they could come back with something completely different before it actually gets passed. So I don't know.
So even before that happened, we saw at Consensus in 2023 this big push for global crypto regulation. I don't know if you remember that happening, but this like team of legal from a bunch of the big crypto institutions got together and they ran a panel and they called for major overhaul and for countries to actually talk to each other and say, hey, just MiCA's doing this, the US is doing this, Canada's doing this, Australia's doing this. Why can't you all just work together on a global template? They talked about maybe just using MiCA as a global template. And then very shortly after that, in September of 2023, we actually saw the G20 get together and start making a global crypto regulation framework.
Yeah, I mean, we've been saying this for a long time, you and I. But what's going to happen? Like, so we just talked about this crypto regulation bill. Now, if you've looked at the bill, it's very long and there's a lot of nonsense, not nonsense, but there's a lot of nuance in there. There's a lot of legalese. Every country, MiCA, I mean, MiCA's like incredibly detailed, and you have to understand all of the nuances. If you're a protocol, us, or somebody looking to enter the space, how could you possibly understand different rules in every country? So yes, TradFi, that used to be the way prior to the internet. But now we have the internet, so we don't need that anymore. It'll be very interesting to see how we possibly transition. I just think it's going to be so difficult until we have some sort of global consensus, because it's such a global space now. So we've been talking about this forever. There's been kind of attempts from some lawyers from the crypto sphere to try to influence it. I think there's a lot of pushback on the other side from TradFi incumbents, lobby.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of pushback because this threatens the status quo of the current financial space in a way that they don't think they can just take everything over and snuff us all out yet. So I sure hope that the G20 and others are saying, hey, let's try to communicate on this. But at least till now, it seems like most of these rules are being made in a vacuum.
Although that's true, IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Securities Commissions, has released policy recommendations for crypto and other digital asset market regulation. So there is a group that's come together. The G20 got together. They probably bickered a lot. But IOSCO came out and said, okay, if you can all agree that tokens are securities, we have some recommendations for you. So we have a couple people in the comments saying, yeah, why don't we just try MiCA around the world? It's very detailed. Sure, you have to understand a lot, but at least the framework has been put out. But maybe there are other less detailed options that allow for some geopolitics to play their hand, because that's part of it too. Is there's so many egos going around. Like, of course, the US and MiCA aren't going to do the same thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, even looking at the UK and how they're trying to deviate from MiCA, it's just like, why?
Go for it.
Like, what are you talking about? And
yeah,
so I actually agree with who was I talking? Who was that? Agent J. MiCA isn't perfect, but it's a start. What I don't like about MiCA is it's very difficult to get licensed. So like that's been one of my biggest criticisms of every jurisdiction is that if the barriers to entry are too high, then people are just going to chance it. They're going to live in the gray area until they no longer can. So I think MiCA is a good test. I've been advocating for, let's just start somewhere. Like, let's figure out what the like minimum viable regulations are to cover 90% of all the nonsense. So if we just make sure that
they can only launch them when they're perfect.
Like it's so weird. And I understand governments move really slow. There's so much bureaucracy, in particular in the United States. In many other jurisdictions, it's similar. But I mean, governments just move so freaking slow. That's the argument against just starting somewhere and then evolving, because it would take us 50 years to evolve. Look at the Securities Act. I mean, it's been constantly updated for the last 80 years. So, I mean, I don't know. I hope we can.
This IOSCO has one thing that I really like, which is that they are just encouraging that everybody's policies have same activity, same risk, same outcome. They don't have to be identical, right? We can allow for some flexibility for your region, but the idea is that if you are participating in finance in this particular type of activity, you should be aware of that risk, and then you should know what that regulatory outcome is. I think that's a pretty good starting place.
Yeah, I mean, again, it'd be amazing if we all just picked something and used it. Whatever that is. I mean, nothing's going to be perfect. I'm going to hate any regulation that comes out because there's going to be stuff in there that's a pain.
Right.
Having said that, knowing what the rules are as opposed to guessing what the rules are two totally different environments. And I would much rather live in the former because this whole guessing thing is not good. For those of us that plan to be here for multiple decades into the future. Yeah, like I mean, we don't want to find ourselves outside of compliance ever.
Right.
Like, it's not about not wanting to be compliant. It's just tell us how. How can we, without completely stifling the entire industry, which is potentially what could happen if they come out with these regulations without a path to getting into compliance quickly. It's gonna snuff out crypto globally, and what's going to happen is only the incumbents that already have adjacent licenses are able to move in, and that sucks. That
Before we go into like specific reporting and case studies, if you will, about what's been going on in the world and how these different regulations have impacted that, do you have anything else to say about the barriers to entry or how that might impact the space going forward?
Yeah, so a good friend of ours, a friend of the pod, Patrick, wrote a really cool Substack on this actually a few months ago on barriers to entry and how it impacts innovation. Mm-hmm. And so if the barriers to entry are too high, TradFi, innovation is very low because it's big, slow behemoths that are responsible for research and development, which generally involves acquisitions, which takes years. Some new little startup somewhere has to come out with a new idea. It has to scale. Mm-hmm. It has to prove that it's viable. Then these guys, the TradFi incumbents, will buy it. It's insanely slow. And most people, I mean, again, I was in TradFi for years. I mean, if you want to start a new entity, like if I wanted to start a new bank, like it's a non-starter. You need hundreds of millions of dollars effectively to do any of that stuff. And so where on earth with a new idea do you go and raise $100 million? Hey, I've got this new product, but I need $100 million to get it off the ground. You're going to look at me and go, pardon? $100 million. Unless it was NVIDIA chips, which you could probably sell for more than you paid for them, and it costs about $1 billion for an AI startup. That's totally different. That's an asset that's got value. Arguably it depreciates, but whatever. But in this case, it's just all going to rent seeking, regulators and attorneys. It's crazy. Absolutely. And so if the barriers are too high, innovation goes to near zero, or you just get more of the old guard. If the barriers are too low, which arguably they have been, you get too many scams. You get too many, like anybody can launch a shitcoin and call it a legitimate project. And how do you?
Yeah, but like, am I tired of getting rugged? Yes. Am I tired of investing with BlackRock? Also, yes. Where's my middle ground, right?
Exactly. So like, I mean, we got to find somewhere in the middle. I think hopefully the pendulum swings a little bit. But I'm really concerned about global coordination of regulation, to be honest. Like it's something that meaningfully keeps me up at night still, because I just don't understand how we're going to be able to transition. I don't see a path forward right now, unless somehow they appoint supreme leader of all regulation to some company that we can all live underneath it and still be regulated. I don't know. In every jurisdiction, which would be kind of crazy. But that's kind of what Ripple's trying to do. Ripple's slowly in every country just acquiring licenses for, money transmission and all of these different things. True. And quietly just accumulating resources, accumulating assets, accumulating this exposure. And then one day they're going to be like, oh, we're licensed in 85 countries. We're licensed in 130 countries. And we're all going to be like, what the fuck? I can't even get licensed in one. I mean, again, what that shows you is that again, those barriers are increasing and increasing. The only people that can afford to travel around and buy all these licenses are the Coinbase, the Ripple, the Binance of the world. The rest of us, if we can find these licenses to purchase, they're in the multiple millions of dollars and many months of the transition period. So like, it's not like I can just go and get licensed tomorrow. Right. Without a massive cost. So I'm really concerned, to be honest. Like, I don't understand what the future looks like. We've come up with some solutions that we think will work, or at least help make it easier, but there's so much uncertainty about it. The market's just not ready to make.
There's uncertainty, but there's also fear, which I'm going to use as an easy transition into some of these news cases. So MiCA, the markets and crypto assets regulation that's going to be governing the EU, is supposed to come into play in 2024. Well, almost a full year in advance. So in October of 2023, Cyprus started to just go for it. They started to use the MiCA regulation, and they increased the penalties, because MiCA is like a baseline and then you can go above and beyond that. They increased the penalties. So if you are non-compliant with the Cyprus Securities and Exchange Commission, you can have fines of up to 350,000 euros and imprisonment. They think that this is about anti-money laundering, but in reality, it just means which crypto service providers are going to operate there. And what does that look like? And if this is an insight or a window into what Europe is going to look like once they enact MiCA, how do we move beyond that?
Yeah, I really don't know how we move beyond that. That's the problem. Is it doesn't matter what MiCA does or what the US does or what Singapore, or I think one of our friends in the chat was talking about Hong Kong, which we've talked about quite a bit as being a bit of a regulatory testing ground. My concern is that it doesn't matter what they each individually do and which one's good and which one's not. The problem is, in fact, in global incongruence in regulatory structures. And so I think, again, we see people like, I mean, we've talked quite a bit about this, but we've talked about Binance. We've talked about, they're getting kicked out of certain jurisdictions and trying to get in others. And I mean, to me, it just seems like a giant hot mess. And Cyprus, Cyprus saying we're going to have like super stringent regulations. Cool. But what did that do? What did it do?
Briefly, they were considered like the EU darling of crypto because at least they had rules.
Yeah, but then all of a sudden
did that do anything for them? Not really.
You make your rules so prohibitively restrictive that all of a sudden everybody just leaves. And so that's kind of what we've been saying about the US and this, like, we're all securities and the SEC is your daddy. I mean, is it even worth it? Like,
because you've mentioned the US and Binance, I should just throw up there that then on December 7th, 2023, US regulators and Binance marked a pivotal moment where Binance decided to be transparent and compliant. This is when we saw SEC step down from there and go to court and all that kind of stuff. But this was a really big deal because, as you've mentioned, Binance has just been moving around trying to avoid unnecessary costs in terms of compliance and regulation. But then we saw them say, okay, you're going to have crypto surveillance. There's going to be regulation. Fine. If we want to participate in your market, I guess we have to participate that way. Pretty funny.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a little fuddy on Binance. I'm a little fuddy on what regulators are expecting from institutions. I'm pretty fuddy in general. And this has been going back. This isn't just this most recent agreement from Binance. I mean, Binance and many other exchanges have been sharing transaction data with global regulators for years. So in Canada, there was a ruling, I think in 2019 or 2020, that all of your transactions retroactively to like 2017 or something were all then reported by all parties in Canada. So, I mean, again, we're going to have to find some middle ground here. Like, regulators do want oversight. They believe that that's part of how they protect users, which is strange. But I don't know. I just think it's going to be so.
Okay, all of this brings us to this week's news, which is USDC decoupling from Tron. So basically, what all this is getting at is like, yes, we have black market. We're not condoning that, and then there's this gray market where we're asking for regulation, but maybe for a little bit of a loosey-goosey compliance because it takes people time and money, and we don't want to restrict innovation. But what we're seeing is there's actually a gap being created between those who are highly compliant and those who can't quite get there yet. It's not that they don't want to be compliant. It's not that they're necessarily against regulation. It's just that they're in this weird space where there's huge barriers to entry, and how are they supposed to get there? So just this week, Circle announced that they're halting USDC minting on Tron. They're making this exit because of legal challenges faced by Tron's founder, Justin Sun. So this isn't even about Tron specifically, but about the founder. And I don't know. I don't know why we're trying to become so partisan, even within our crypto space.
But I mean, you kind of can't blame people, right? So if we look at like what the litigation has essentially implied, if you look at, well, Ripple as an example, or many others, it's not just what you're doing now that matters. It's things that you may have done in conjunction with other parties, that could be the thing that is your demise. It could be, well, USDC, Circle, very compliant, very above board, highly regulated, generally speaking, as far as we can be regulated currently. They're saying, you know what, like, we just can't deal with the potential fallout of dealing with Tron. If it's determined that Tron has been doing all of this stuff outside of regulation, are we contributing? Are we now implicated into that? And so again, this gray area is a huge problem. It's a huge, and I've been complaining about this to anybody that'll listen, but it's a huge problem because we're all trying to do the best we possibly can, but no one knows what's right.
Yeah.
So you've got, like you said, people that are already kind of highly regulated or have adjacent businesses in other spaces that are regulated, Circle, Noble, like some of these other entities. They're not willing to take a risk with someone that is already in hot water and under the microscope. Like, I mean, so there's so many reasons this gray area sucks, but this is a big one, is that it's going to make a lot of partnerships that otherwise could have been amazing with some clarity and the ability for them to come into compliance. These partnerships could be incredible, but they're just not going to happen because people are uncertain about risk. And I mean, honestly, the bigger your company, the bigger the risk. They're first going to go after highly capitalized, high market cap businesses. That's how it is. That's where they get more money from. It's worth their time. The fines are bigger, you know? So the circles have a lot more to worry about than, you know, smaller companies in the space, which sucks because the circles are the ones that you want to partner with. They're, you know, highly adopted, highly respected. And we got to find ways for people to be able to do this. I know today I was super funny on this whole thing. We have talked about the last kind of few years, I guess, of kind of the evolution of regulation. I'm just so disappointed with the process of regulation so far. It's been so disjointed and so confusing, and where it's heading, I'm not excited about, to be honest. I hope somehow we come up with a better solution, but I don't know.
So before we go, I know that we're at the end. I just want to really quick run through kind of where some of the world is at in terms of regulation. So we've been talking about the US because we love the US. There's been oversight since 2017. I think we said it was 2021 that we really saw the SEC take an active stance. They are still very focused on securities, just general compliance. The EU is looking at MiCA. That regulation is going to be very comprehensive. It's published. You can go take a look at it. It's supposed to be implemented this year. Singapore has had the Payment Services Act since 2020, which is supposedly covers all crypto services, kind of making them a hub. We do have a lot of DEXs coming out of Singapore all the time. Japan started recognizing Bitcoin as a payment in 2017, but they have really strict regulations on exchanges and centralized and decentralized. We see a lot of nations like Nigeria just having the central bank overlook crypto, which is pretty difficult. Australia has their own guidelines called ASIC. They are really focused on consumer protection. In theory, that's where the UK is going as well. Canada has been treating crypto like securities for what, 3 years? 4 years?
3-4 years, yeah.
Yeah. China, well, China news is, who knows? In theory, China has a ban on crypto transactions and mining since 2021, but we also see them coming out with things like CBDCs that are on chain and what have you. And as some of our viewers mentioned, Hong Kong is definitely a regulatory testing ground for new business. But one of the things that I think is most interesting is BRICS. Last year, we had over 19 countries apply to join BRICS. They have all kinds of different regulation. It looks like India and Brazil are maybe going to be clearer, but have higher taxes. But one thing that we've observed with BRICS over the last year is that it looks like they're doing a lot of little MVPs and are going to figure out what's going to work the best and then consolidate that. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see BRICS nations coming out with something more solid before 2030. That is like regulation in a nutshell. That's your
sometime before 2030, maybe we'll have
24. That's like 5 years. That gives them 2 years to trial what they're doing now, 2 years to trial something else, 1 year to fuck up CBDCs, and then they'll put something in place.
I don't like waiting that long. What I do love is our DGen Roundtable guys and all their comments. I mean, the Grayscale ETF or Grayscale saying that the ETH ETF, we've been saying that too. It is going to happen. I just don't think it's going to happen on the very first try. But I could be wrong. I'm usually wrong. So let's hope that that's the case. I mean, this whole GDP growth thing, we were talking a little bit about this with respect to taxation yesterday, and how countries like to sabotage their own GDP growth for short-term spending ideas, which is, to me, ridiculous. But you know, the U.S. government right now is doing a pretty active job in pushing away most of us that are, you know, very willing to try to engage and abide by regulation and have our businesses domiciled in the U.S. and try to service U.S. users. I I sure hope we find a path here. It's not looking hot.
JD, I think this is the funniest episode we've had in like a couple of months.
Well,
maybe for all of season 3 so far.
It's only because I'm running 15 minutes behind and everybody's waiting. So I'm like, panic. But we're all good.
All right,
okay.
all right.
So this weekend, even though the market has been like kind of all over the place, and Uniswap turned fees on, and everybody's all fired up about that today, and the Uniswap token's up 50%, and we're all freaking out about it. Go touch some grass, spend some time with your family. Crypto will be here next week.
Stare directly into the sun.
We got you covered on the news roundup on Monday from the weekend. So not to worry, we got you back. Come see us 12:30 p.m. Eastern Monday, live show every day of the week. And with that, today I say to you, Kiara, have a great weekend and go find yourself.
Do it.
One of these days I'm going to mess